Well, welcome everybody to Christmas at Cedar Creek. I really appreciate you joining us this morning in the middle of what I am sure is an increasingly busy, stressful, chaotic time for all of us. But I really pray that our time together and your investment of your valuable time this morning will encourage you. Whatever you're going through, whatever you're dealing with this morning, I hope you find some encouragement. But I'm also hoping that this morning God's Word might also challenge all of us to take a next step in our faith journey. So I hope and pray that God meets you here today in a very real and a very personal way. You know, there's something about the birth of a child that brings out a whole panacea of intensive emotions, right? There's a lot of emotions, right, on a spectrum whenever a child is born. Like, I remember the birth of our very first child. I remember for Terry and I, there was a lot of joy and excitement and anticipation of this child, but I also remember kind of underneath just feeling completely terrified and overwhelmed. I was pretty sure at 26 years of age, I was barely mature enough to manage my own life. The thought of being responsible for another human being is like, I ain't ready for that. And then I remember all the emotions during labor and, all the fear of something going wrong. And then I remember brought that precious little boy wrapped in that blanket, and I got to hold him for the first time, and it was deep, deep joy. And then 24 hours later, they said, you got to go, you got to take him home. And I was terrified again, right? Listen, the birth of all of our children, those were memorable moments. But the birth of our youngest son took drama to a whole nother level, right? He was what they call a scheduled induction, which basically means the doctor tells you to show up at the hospital on this day. They got some kind of magic medicine that causes you to go into labor. And I thought, dude, that is all, how convenient is that? Especially like when you have 3 small children still at home, to not have to worry about, a middle of the night panic rush, figure out who can keep the kids, get to the hospital in time. Like, dude, I love this new technology. So the day comes, we get there, we go through registration, we get signed in, go straight up to labor and delivery. They put us in a room. Terry's in the bed, nurse comes in, starts an IV, and then she starts that magic potion. And sure enough, like 15, 20 minutes later, contractions start. Right? And over the next hour, maybe 2 hours, they're getting more and more intense, and the contractions are coming closer and closer together. I'm like, dude, we're going to have this baby by lunchtime. I might even get to take a nap this afternoon, right? So excited. But for some reason, around 10:30 or 11 o'clock that morning, the contractions started becoming less intense and started coming further and further apart. Now, the doctors talked about it. They weren't worried about it. So if they're not worried, I'm not worried. I'm just chilling out. I'm in the room. Terry's in the bed. And I'll never forget it. It's just Terry and I and our nurse midwife. She's kind of sitting on the foot of the bed, just kind of checking some things with Terry. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, Terry says, I don't feel good. And she barely got good out of her mouth. And her eyes rolled back in her head. She went completely unconscious. Her blood pressure dropped to 0. Bells, monitors, everything's beeping. And then all of a sudden, like 6 doctors and nurses come rushing into the room. I kind of get pushed back into the corner up against the wall. They're saying all kind of things I don't understand, but what I remember as if it was yesterday was our nurse midwife. She is up on the bed with Terry, and she's saying, we got to go. Come on, people, we got to go. We got to go. Let's go. Let's go. And they went. They took the bed, they took Terry with the midwife on it, all those doctors and nurses, they were all gone. And I am in this room completely alone and no idea what's going on. I remember my back against the wall, my knees just gave way. I just slumped to the floor. I put my hands in my face and I was like, oh my God, I've lost my wife. We've lost the child. Just total devastation. Just totally overwhelmed. It felt like I was in that room by myself for hours. I think probably at most it was maybe 20 or 30 minutes in there, just crying, not knowing how to deal with all of this. And then I remember the door opened and the midwife stepped into the room. And you know how when the doctor comes into the waiting room, before they say anything, you try to read their facial expressions? You know what I'm talking about? Like, oh my God. And I'll never forget, she looked down at me and a big old smile across her face. She said, Terry's okay. The baby's okay. Everything's going to be okay. We had to do an emergency C-section, but we got there in time. Apparently, the umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck a couple of times, but we got him. Everything's going to be okay. And I just felt this complete euphoria. I'm like joy like you would not believe. I'm hugging the nurse midwife. I'm running up and down the halls passing out those blue chewing gum cigars. You know, it's a boy. I'm so excited. Listen, in a 30-minute period, I went from joy to despair to overwhelming joy, just like that. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because for all of us in some way, Christmas season has a way of kind of jerking us around emotionally, right? We're high, we're low. It has a way, the holiday season has a way of just magnifying the good, but it also magnifies the bad. And in fact, it has a way of shining a spotlight often on what feels like might be missing or broken in our lives. In fact, that's one of the reasons that Terry and I host every year a special Blue Christmas service. This service is designed, we discovered from our own painful journey, that Christmas hits different when you're hurting, when you're dealing with loss, when you're struggling, when life isn't turning out the way that you plan. You just don't feel all jingle bell, holly jolly. And this service is designed to get past the surface emotions of Christmas and help us focus on the hope and the true joy, the joy beyond circumstances of what Jesus' birth means. And so if you think that might be something you want to be a part of, it's next Sunday, 3 o'clock. I'm inviting you, anyone you know, to be a part of it. But here's the thing, all of us find ourselves on the roller coaster of emotions at Christmas. And if we're not careful, we can find ourselves just feeling like we're trying to just hold on and survive the season instead of really being able to celebrate the birth of Jesus and what his birth really means to us. Because here's the thing, you'll never understand the hope in the manger until you experience the power of the cross. And so that's what we're doing in this series of messages this Christmas, as we're spending the whole month of December focusing on a single verse of Scripture in the Old Testament. And I know like 4 weeks is a lot of time to look at a single passage, but this is not just any old passage. This is the birth announcement of Jesus. It's found in the Old Testament book of Isaiah chapter 9. And if you were with us last week, you know that this prophetic promise of a child who brings hope was given 750 years before Jesus was born, but it was given to the nation of Israel in the midst of one of the deepest, darkest moments in their history. Because the Assyrians had invaded and overwhelmed them, they were in their own slide down the wall, hands in their face moment in life. And in the middle of that darkness, in the middle of that despair and fear and uncertainty, Isaiah points them to a hope that is to come. Notice Isaiah 9 verse 2. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. In other words, in the middle of the darkest moment, the most difficult struggles, there is hope. And then we get to our verse, verse 6, and we find the source of that hope. You know these words, right? For to us a child is born. To us a son is given. And the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And so we are just methodically going through these 4 descriptions, these 4 names of Jesus, to not simply discover who Jesus is and what Jesus is like, but more importantly, how can we allow Him to be those things in our lives? Right? How can He be our wonderful counselor? What do I need to do for Him to be my mighty God, my everlasting Father, my true Prince of Peace? And last week we looked at how to allow Jesus to be our wonderful counselor, to discover that Jesus is not just a good listener who helps you work through your own stuff, but that He is ultimately our divine guide, because He knows us intimately. And because He loves us unconditionally, He and He alone can lead us to the life we are created to live. Now today we're going to look at this second name, that this child born in Bethlehem is Mighty God. Now we know the Christmas story is about God in the flesh. We know that Jesus is God with us, Emmanuel. But Isaiah wants us to understand in the difficulties and struggles of our lives that He is a mighty God. It's interesting, there are a lot of Hebrew words that Isaiah could have chosen to describe the strength and power of God. But the particular word he uses is the Hebrew word Gabor. In fact, that phrase, mighty God, is El Gabor. And Gabor, whenever it's used in the Old Testament, is almost always associated with a soldier preparing for battle. The strength of a warrior, strength for battle, God's power to overcome the tough circumstances of life. And that is the good news of Christmas, that God's divine power, His mighty power, is available for the battles of our lives. In fact, look at what David writes in Psalm 68. He says, "You," talking to God, "you, God, are awesome in your sanctuary. The God of Israel gives power and strength to His people. Praise be to God." You see what he's saying? God's power is not just some emotional experience you get to have as a part of a Sunday morning experience. God's power is available for our daily lives. The same power that spoke the universe into existence, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead, is available for the biggest battles and the toughest circumstances of our lives. So that's my question. What is your toughest battle right now? What difficult struggle are you going through right now, Christmas 2024? Maybe you've lost someone. Maybe you're about to lose someone because a marriage or a relationship has fallen apart. Maybe you're in the fight of your financial life. Maybe you're fighting a battle with your health. Maybe you're fighting a battle against a temptation that you can't ever seem to win, and it just keeps leading you back to the same old self-destructive choices. Look, whatever your battle is, God's power is available to you. Now, I think most of us have no problem believing that God is powerful. We're just not sure how we can have that power in our lives. And so this morning, I want to focus specifically on how we can access God's power for our battles. And to help us do that, we're going to look at an encounter that Jesus has with a woman who is in the fight of her life, who is walking through one of the most difficult circumstances in her life. You'll find her story in the New Testament Gospel of Mark. It's Mark chapter 5, so you can turn or click there if you have a Bible or a Bible app. Mark is the second book of the New Testament between Matthew and Luke. If you're doing notes on our app, there's a link you can click and go right to it. It's a familiar story. When you start looking at it, you go, oh yeah, I think I've heard that before, right? This is the woman who has had an issue of bleeding. She's been bleeding for 12 straight years. And finally, when Jesus comes to her town, she pushes through the crowd, gets close enough to him, touches the hem of his garment, and immediately she is healed. You probably know that story, but as we walk through it, we're going to see three things that she does to access God's power in her battle, because they're the same three things we can do in our battles to have God's power. So let's jump in. Number one, the first thing I have to do to access God's power is I got to recognize my need. It starts by recognizing my need. Until I admit that I can't fix it and I can't keep fighting it on my own, we'll never access God's power. If you think you can deal with this stuff in your own power and strength, that is exactly how you will deal with it, without God's power. You know, if you read the Gospels or you watch The Chosen, you know that in the second half of Jesus' earthly ministry, he became hugely popular, right? Everybody heard about it. So everywhere he went, he had to deal with massive crowds. It was like a celebrity thing. Jesus showed up, word got out, just hundreds and hundreds of people rushed to be around him, to get close to him. And so that's exactly what happens. One day, Jesus and his disciples arrive by boat. They cross the Sea of Galilee in a boat, and they arrive on the shore of this village. And when they arrive, a crowd shows up. Immediately, there's this huge crowd. And check out what happens, beginning with verse 25. It said, and a woman was there, in other words, in that village, who had been the subject of bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. And yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. A couple things to notice there. First, her battle is a medical issue, a health issue. She has a bleeding condition. Most scholars believe that this was sort of an ongoing menstrual bleeding, that it wasn't part of a cycle, it just continued all the time, which that in and of itself is a medical issue. But because she's a first century Jew, that type of bleeding would make her unclean for worship, for going in the synagogue. And not only was she considered unclean, but anybody or everybody that she touched while she was bleeding, they would become unclean. And they would have to isolate and not go into the synagogue for 7 days, for a full week. And so not only is she battling this medical health issue, she's also battling it alone. She's isolated. She can't be with family. She can't be with anyone. That's a tough battle. But the key thing I want you to see is that phrase, all she had. She'd gotten to the end of herself. She had reached the limits of human power and ability and first century medicine to help her, and she didn't get better. She got worse. But that's where the good news is. Because that's where God's power shows up best. When we get to the end of ourselves. Right? You remember the Apostle Paul, right? Who had that physical condition that he called a thorn in the flesh. And you know, he kept begging God to heal him from it. And you remember God's response? It wasn't to heal him. God says, my grace is sufficient for you. But that is not all that God says to Paul. Notice what else God says. Notice the rest of that verse, 2 Corinthians 12:9. God says, my power is made perfect in what? What's that word? Weakness. So Paul says, therefore, I'll boast the more gladly about my weakness. Why? So that Christ's power may rest on me. It's interesting, right? Because unlike this woman who we'll read gets physical healing, Paul does not get physically healed from his disease, but he gets God's power to keep on fighting in spite of the struggle. See, that's the way it is with God's power. Sometimes it heals you and fixes the circumstances. Sometimes it just gives you the strength to keep on fighting. Either way, we win. I don't know what your battle is. And I don't know whether God will win over the circumstances the way you want, or whether He will just give you the strength to keep on fighting. But what I do know is the only way to access that power is to get to the end of you. To recognize that God and God alone can fight that battle. That's why I say the biggest barrier for us as Christians, the biggest barrier to God's power actually showing up in our lives and our circumstances is pride. It's pride. Thinking that we can do it on our own. In fact, that's why Peter writes in 1 Peter 5:6, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand. Why? So that He may lift you up. Until you humble yourself, He's not going to lift you up. And notice that last part, in due time. That's the struggle, isn't it? Right? We want God's power and we want it right now to do what we want it to do. And I get that. I've had that prayer many times in my journey. But I'm starting to understand that God is so much more than a genie in the bottle to grant my wishes. He loves me too much to give me what I think I want or need. He just wants me to come to Him and trust Him. And that takes humility. A lot of us think about humility as like, a weak person, somebody who, can't do life on their own. Or we think of humility as self-pity. I'm a bad person. God could never, the reason I got all these problems is because I'm such a bad person. But listen, humility is not thinking of myself less. Humility is just recognizing that I have limits and that God doesn't. So let me ask you, that battle you're fighting right now, is there some place that maybe pride is showing up a little bit? You're still trying to control the circumstances a little bit on your own. You're still trying to control to get the outcome you want. You're still trying to manipulate and control other people to get the circumstances to go the way you want them to. You want God's power for your battle? You got to recognize your need. Number 2, we have to connect with Jesus on a deeper level. Connect with Jesus on a deeper level. That kind of makes sense. You want God's power? Well, you got to connect with the source of that power. And notice that is exactly what this lady in Mark 5 does. Notice verse 27. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind Him in the crowd and touched His cloak. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. You see that transition? And I'm not talking about the transition from sick to well, from hurting to healed. I'm talking about the transition that goes from hearing about Jesus to being close enough to touch Him, right? From being aware of other people's experiences and testimonies with Jesus to having your own personal experience with Jesus. The level of God's power I experience in my life is going to be directly proportional to the depth of my connection to Jesus. Not my words, Jesus' words. Look at what He says, John 15:4. Jesus says, remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. We read that and we think about fruit, doing good deeds. Good. You need to understand, for the first century Jewish mindset, fruit was not just the result of the natural scientific process of growth of plants. Fruit was always an expression of God's miraculous power. They didn't think about the fruit that grew in their vineyard as being, well, I worked really hard and I did all the right things, so I got this good fruit on my vine. Though they knew fruit was always a symbol of God's miraculous power. In fact, that's why part of the Jewish worship was to bring what they called the first fruit. They literally brought some of the first fruit from their orchards and vineyards and gave it as an offering, as an act of worship. And in doing so, they were saying, I recognize all the fruit in my vineyard is a miracle of you, and I'm just giving back a portion of the first part of it. They were not thinking, I did all this hard work and I earned all this great fruit, so let me give God a little tip of fruit. You know, He helped me out. Nowhere in their mind did they think, I worked really hard and God kind of showed up and helped me out. No, they understood no fruit apart from God's power. In fact, that's why we in the New Testament church encourage as an act of worship to bring some of the first fruit of your finances, to give financially, right? And it's not about, well, you worked really hard, but, you know, God helped you out, so give God a tip. No, it's recognizing it's all His. It's all His. You say, well, I worked for it. Well, who gave you the body? Who gave you the strength? Who gave you breath in your lungs? Fruit is always symbolic of God's divine power. But listen, Jesus wants us to recognize more than the fact that when I have God's blessings and God's power, right, that's a part of my life. He wants us to realize the only way you get that is by remaining in Him. Did you notice how many times Jesus used the word remain? It's one sentence. He says remain 4 times. For a first century rabbi, repetition was a teaching tool to emphasize. Anytime Jesus repeats something, pay attention, right? Look here, this matters. And Jesus said, you got to remain. Look, it's not just a one-time encounter, right? You know, I went through a catechism class and I got baptized, or I walked down the aisle, shook a pastor's hand, or I had this emotional moment, I gave my heart to Jesus and I got baptized, and now I don't understand why Jesus' power ain't showing up in my life. No, it's not how it works. That's not how any of this works. It requires a daily connect. Remember, we talked about this last week. I feel like I'm back teaching high school again. We talked about this last week. You know, don't you remember this? That it has to have a relationship. Have to spend time with Him, right? That quiet time in His Word, in prayer. You got to be connected through Him by connecting through His body, the church, other Christ followers. That's all about remaining in Him. It won't work any other way. Your spiritual life is not like your cell phone. You can't plug it in overnight and get a whole day of power from it, right? How many of you have to charge your phone at least once every day, every 24 hours? How many of you can get 2 days out of a charge, right? Anybody get 3 days? Yeah, those are the rich people with the new iPhone 16. But you don't have a battery when it comes to your spiritual life. This only works if you stay plugged in all the time. Look, I don't know what you know about plants and vineyards and grapevines, right? But the branches don't disconnect from the vine, go out and do their thing, and then when you get a little tired, a little drained, or there's a drought, run back and go, let me plug back into the vine, get a little more juice. Okay, no. They have to stay connected to the vine in the good days, the droughts, the bad days. It's all about a connection. Let me save you some disappointment. Don't expect God's power to show up as long as you continue to stay disconnected to Jesus. It has to be constant. So here's a question. What's one step you could take? Whether you're a new believer, you've been a mature Christ follower for 50 years, what's one step you could take to increase the level of your authentic, intimate connection with Jesus? Do you need to spend a little more time in His Word and in prayer? Or do you just need to get more consistent with it? I know that's what I struggle with. I have 4 or 5 days, man, great quiet times in the morning, all that, and then, all of a sudden life, and I let that get in the way. Do you need to get connected a little more with the body of Christ, other believers? This woman had to fight her battle in isolation. She didn't have a choice. Far too many of us are fighting our battles in self-imposed isolation. It's not how we were created. Accessing God's power starts with recognizing my need, connecting deeper with Jesus, and then finally, number 3, and this is the hardest, I have to act as if you already had it. Right? Accessing God's power for my battles, I need to act like I already have God's power. In other words, I have to step out in faith as if God's power was already guaranteed. If I knew that I knew, no doubt, He was going to show up and give me what I need. Did you know almost every experience of God's power in the Bible, in the life of an individual, almost every time an individual experiences God's power in their life, it is linked to their expression of faith. They express faith and God's power shows up. Certainly was that way with this lady. Notice in verse 28, before she gets to Jesus, says she thought, this is her thinking, if I touch his clothes, I will be healed. You see that? Not I might or I hope. What an amazing expression of faith. She's not like, well, I've tried every other doctor. Let me try this rabbi. No, she was convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus was what she needed. And listen, it is impossible for us to fully understand how risky a step of faith this was for her. Right? Because remember, she's unclean and anybody she touches becomes unclean. So to get to Jesus, she's got to make about 50 people unclean, right? And she's already an outcast. Nobody likes her anyway. She's about to make it work. And then when she touches Jesus, this celebrity rabbi, this rabbi that everybody wants to hear from and be around, he's going to have to isolate for 7 days the moment she touches him. That is a huge risk. And she does it. Read the rest of the passage. I hope you will. She somehow works her way through the crowd. She's down low. She touches the hem of his garment. Jesus stops, and you know what he says? Somebody touch me. Right? And the disciples are like, yeah, duh. You're surrounded with people. I touch you. He touched you. She touched you. What are you talking about, Jesus? Everybody touched. He said, no. This is a different kind of touch. Remember what he said? I felt power go out from me. And then Jesus just stands there. Somebody touch me. And I'm sure this woman was thinking, if I just got to get out of here, nobody knows. But it's obvious, Jesus ain't taking another step till he finds out who touches him. And I guess she just gave up and said, well, I might as well come clean, right? And so she walks up, she falls before him in fear and trembling. She thinks she's going to get in trouble. She thinks she's gotten away because I'm a bad person. I don't deserve God's power, and I got it. I better run with it, right? And now he's going to take it back. I don't know, all those thoughts. But she was afraid. And I love Jesus' response, verse 34. He said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Two things I don't want you to miss. One, he calls her daughter, right? This outcast, this isolated, this pariah who can't even touch or be touched, and he calls her daughter. I love that. Jesus healed her deepest wounds, her emotional wounds, before he ever heals her physically. And when he does, look at what he says. This is strange. He says, your faith has healed you. That doesn't make any sense, right? Obviously, it was God's power. She tried everything. She'd done all that she could do. How is her faith healing her? God's power comes to us through our faith. She accessed that power because of her faith. That's what faith is. Faith is choosing God's way, the right way, the narrow way, the difficult way, the way that's opposite from the culture and everything around us. It's choosing God's way before his power shows up, right? It's choosing God's way when you have no idea how it's going to turn out or what the end result is. And you say, whoa, wait a minute, Philip. You mean I got to act like I have God's power? Is that what you're saying? I got to act like God's power before I actually have God's power? No, I'm not saying it. God's saying it. Look at Hebrews 11:1. It says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance, think about that, assurance about what we do not see. That phrase, I was reading this passage this week, and that phrase, confidence and hope in what we do not see, and it reminded me of a documentary that I saw years and years ago. It was a documentary on trapeze artists. You know what I'm talking about? The daring men that fly through the air with the greatest of ease. And apparently what I learned from this documentary is there's two kinds of trapeze artists. There are flyers and there are catchers. The flyer's job is to let go at just the right time, and the catcher's job is to be there and catch them at just the right time. But what I also discovered is at the moment when the flyer has to let go, they cannot see the catcher. They just have to trust that the catcher's going to be there. And that's what Jesus is saying. Trust me. Not when I feel close and everything's working out. Trust me when life doesn't make sense. Trust my way when everything and everyone around you says, go this way. Let go. And here's the really cool thing about faith in Jesus. You take a risk and take a step of faith, and it turns out to be the wrong one. God wasn't really leading you to do that. Guess what? We're always still caught in the net of God's grace, no matter what, even when we get it wrong. And in fact, when we get it wrong, you know what the Bible promises? That God can work even through that for our good and His glory. So what's one step of faith you could take right now? What's one thing you feel like God is leading you to do? One way you could act as if you knew God's power was there and you knew the outcome was going to be the best. What would you do? What step would you take? I don't know your battle. And I don't know the emotional roller coaster you're on. And I don't know the places where the Christmas season is shining a spotlight on your deepest disappointments and struggles and pain. But I do know this. Our God is faithful. And our God is mighty. And that the hope of Christmas, the hope in the manger, is found in the power of the cross and the resurrection. And so I want to close our time this morning with another Christmas promise. This Christmas promise comes from the same one we've been looking at. It comes from the prophet Isaiah. And notice what he says. He, talking about God, He will not grow tired or weary. I know you're tired. I know you're weary. I feel it myself. But He will not grow tired or weary. And listen to this. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Oh, that is my hope. That is my hope for every one of us this Christmas. Would you pray with me? Oh, Father, I'm so thankful as we go into the Christmas season that it's so much more than a magic baby born to a virgin in a manger. That it is hope incarnate. That you enter the broken messiness of our lives. And you pour out your strength and your power as we depend on you. As we start to let go of the things we've been holding on too tightly to because we think we can't live without them. Oh God, help us this Christmas in the middle of our joy and anticipation and excitement, in the middle of our fears and pain. Help us in all those emotions to keep our eyes on you and what your birth means in our daily lives. Move among your people right now, Lord. Move among them to respond in whatever way your Spirit is prompting them. Give them the courage to take that step, to connect, to give financially, to have a conversation, to pick up the phone and try to reconcile that broken relationship this Christmas. Or just to radically show love to the people who are unlovely. Whatever it is, Jesus. We want your power displayed in our lives, not to make much of us, but to make much of you, and to point the people around us who are living in darkness to the light of a child who was born. It's in your name I pray, Jesus. Amen.